I was reminded this morning as I walked in this building, my wife fixed a very large, she fixed several things, but one of the things she fixed was a very large Pyrex dish of baking beans, baked beans, not baking beans, baked beans. And there is a blood path from my car all the way back, and it's all over my suit. So I ran home and changed. And when I changed, I was thinking about the time when Suzanne and I go places to try out, or I go speak places. I usually carry more than one suit. I carry two suits for that very reason. And it's a good thing because Ethan was little bitty. We were going to leave Bradford, Tennessee, so that would have been 1991. Ethan was little. He just turned one. Anyway, we were at some folks' house. We were trying out. We were at folks' house in Missouri. And we were fixing to have breakfast, and we bowed our heads for the prayer, and dumb preacher Darty forgot to keep one eye open and watch the kid. And so while we're sitting there, he reaches up, grabs my coffee, and pulls it all on him and on me. And so I was thankful I had two suits. And so today I was thankful I lived very close. But anyway, all right, we're ready for Esther chapter 9. We're ready for verse 11. Any announcements we need to make? We do express our sympathy to Miss Minnie in the passing of her brother. The announcements are on the announcement sheet, but do get around, say something to Miss Minnie. That would be great. Other things, like I say, they're all on the announcement sheet. Is there anything else we need to announce, think about, talk about? Not yet. We will eventually get there. If you're part of the prayer ministry, and we hope everybody is, there's new cards out in the back. And if you want one here, I've got a few that I haven't made it back to the back yet. I'll be glad to hand you one. And all we ask is that for a period of about 3 weeks, those three people that are on your card, you specifically, whatever you know about the situation, and there's nothing there but just their name, but you just pray for them. And if you don't know anything, that's fine. You still pray for them. And then at the end of 3 weeks, if you can, if you have the opportunity, you give them a call or send them a letter or a note and just say, hey, I've been praying for you for the last 3 weeks. And so it's a great thing to do. So we would encourage everybody to be a participant in that. All right, Esther chapter 9, beginning in verse 11. This is the end, if you will. This is the end of Esther, the book of Esther. We're going to actually spend most of our time this morning talking about the Feast of Purim. But this is the end of the threat from Haman and his sons as they are, as the text says, hung on the gallows. And remember, we don't need really probably to go over the story. Everybody's been here for the most part. Esther was, or she became, maybe the best way to kind of jump on into chapter 2 and chapter 3. She became queen because Vashti refused the king, and so Esther became, through a series of events, became queen, and her kinfolks, if you will, by the name of Mordecai, raised her, because we don't know why, or we don't know what happened to her parents, but Mordecai raised her. And Mordecai he was sort of what we would call today a helicopter parent. He was right there. And he would always go to the gate, and he'd go to the gate daily, and he would listen to people talk, but he was wanting to find out about Esther and how she was and how everything was going, how she was getting along, and everybody doing her well. Because remember, they were of a Jewish background, and they were in the midst of Persia, which was not Jewish at all. They were polytheistic for the most part, many gods. And so Mordecai heard of a plot to overtake the king, and he eventually got word to the king that plot has been hatched to kill you. And so he avoids that. He's thankful to Mordecai. But as time rolls on, Mordecai being a Jew, does not fall down and worship Haman, who was basically the prime minister right under King Ahasuerus. And this upset Haman. Now, we don't know exactly why Mordecai did not fall down and worship as he thought he should. And so, whatever the reason, Mordecai just kept getting madder and madder, if you will. Or excuse me, Haman kept getting madder and madder. And Mordecai ended up pushing Esther because Mordecai had gotten a decree signed, or actually he had been given permission to sign his own decree, and that was annihilate the Jews. And so Haman, in that plot to get all the Jews killed, Mordecai pushes Esther, let's go to the king, we got to get this changed, we got to get it fixed, we got to get it changed. And she does. Of course, he asks and he ponders that great question, who knows whether you will come to the kingdom for such time as this, which has led us that when we conclude the book of Esther, which will be today, hopefully, and if not, it will definitely be the first part of next week, and we'll transition into a mini-series on the Providence of God, that as we think about those things, that then, so Haman is actually going to be killed upon his own gallows that he made to kill the Jews, because Esther goes into the king Ahasuerus and says, hey, we need to talk, and she eventually does. He gives her the signet ring, gives her everything that he had given to Haman to get a decree signed, and she uses it basically to just overrun everything that Haman had planned and to change a law which didn't happen in this part of the world in that point in time. But it is then that we have the killing now. Instead of the Jews, we have the killing of those that were in opposition to the Jewish folks. And it says, verse 11, on that day, the number of those who were killed in Shushan, the citadel. Now remember, this is where the I want to say castle, but that's not an appropriate place. This is where the king lived. This was the city, the capital city in some regards. But it says that those were killed in Shushan, the citadel, was brought to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan, the citadel, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your petition? It shall be granted to you. Or what is your father's request? It shall be done. Then Esther said, if it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in Shushan to do again tomorrow according to today's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. So she asked for an extra day. Give us one more day. Give us one more time. We need an extra day. And so the king commanded this to be done, and the decree was issued in Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. They hung them, and so you say, well, that's 510 that we know that were killed. Well, yeah. But it's interesting that it's believed that they hung Haman's sons in front of everybody else, sort of as a sign, sort of as a, you need to see this, you need to know that this is happening, and so kind of show them that no one is above the law, no one is above what has been made, and so you have Mordecai, who's, of course, watching all of this. You have Esther that's watching all of this. And you see that the plot, basically to kill the Jews, has been done away with. And it says, and the Jews who were in Shushan, this is verse 15, gathered together again to the 14th day of the month of Adar and killed 300 men at Shushan. But they did not lay a hand on the plunder. So they're killing these folks, but one of the things they're not doing is they're not taking the spoils of the land. They're going throughout the land and they're killing all of these folks that are against the Jews, all of these Persians. But they're not taking, they're not going through people's stuff and taking the goodies, if you will, or the valuables from these folks. Which you might say, well, why? Why wouldn't they? Well, why should they? Maybe it was just to show the fact that, hey, we're only after the people that are really trying to destroy us. Maybe it was the fact that the emphasis was not upon the plunder or the power, but was upon the idea of just taking folks and taking them down so that they, as Jews, would be safe. I mean, you could go on and you could guess. You could say, this is possibly the possibility. This is the answer. I don't know. The Bible doesn't say. It just says that they didn't take the plunder. They simply were going about killing these folks, killing these men that were opposed to them. The remainder of the Jews in the king's provinces, beginning in verse 16, gathered together and protected their lives, had rest from their enemies, and killed 75,000 of their enemies. But they did not lay a hand on the plunder. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th of the month they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Okay, so you have them going forth, and you have them killing, as it says in verse 16, the rest of their enemies. They killed 75,000 of their enemies. I do know that if you go into theological circles, different folks from a standpoint of just wanting to argue, they want to argue the number 75,000. The text seems to say 75,000, and so we should leave it at that. They killed a tremendous number of people. Now you might say, well, if our census figures that we quoted last week were true, in the province of the Persian kingdom, there were 50 million folks, 20 million of them being Jews, so 30 million. So 75,000 is not everybody, but it's a large portion, isn't it? How did they kill them? Did they hang them? Did they bring them all to Shushan and hang them on the gallows that Haman had prepared for the Jews? The text doesn't say. But it says, and we should get a sense of the fact that this was almost a cleansing of the folks in Persia that were against the Jews. And notice what it says in verse 17, that they did this on the 13th day of the month of Adar. Now, this was the same time, this happening was on the same time that Haman had set up to kill the Jews. The month of Adar, remember the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar. Ours is based upon the sun, right? 365 days. Actually, it's 365 and a quarter days to get around the sun. But the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar. It's based upon the moon. And there's a lot of fluctuation in the Jewish calendar because of that period not being regular each year. And so you have to add, and then there's months taken off. But Adar is, for our understanding, is about anywhere from, say, the middle of February, last of February, to the middle to last of March. So somewhere in that time frame, you kind of have a sense of time frame when it is. But notice that they turned this bloodbath into a time of feasting, it says, and gladness. The word gladness, the Hebrew word, means celebration, rejoicing. They turn what really for us looks like a terrible spot in their history to a time of celebration, a time of feasting, because if you want to equate it to something good, they were saved. They were saved from the Persians annihilating them. And so from that standpoint, there is then, as we'll see in just a second, beginning in verse 18, there is a feast that the Jews, certain of the Jews, still today honor and remember. Purim. It's the only one that's not found in the Pentateuch, especially in the book of Leviticus. It's the only one that they keep that's not found. Hanukkah and Passover and Pentecost and all of those are found in the Old Testament and book of Leviticus, but not Purim. Purim is the only one, and yet it's still kept. And we'll talk a little bit about it in just a second. Anything anybody like to ask or say? All right, well, we'll move on. Verse 18. The Jews who were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day as well as on the 14th. And on the 15th of the month, they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore, the Jews of the village who dwelt in the unwalled towns celebrated the 14th day of the month of Adar with gladness. There's that word again. Remember, it just means celebration. And feasting as a holiday and for sending presents to one another, which is still, I guess as we go along, it's probably best. This is something they still do today. They still send presents on Purim. They still acknowledge this day, but they send presents to one another. And they also, one of the things that they do today is this is a day, Purim is considered a day to help those that need help. And so they send, a lot of times their contributions, sometimes annual contribution, but they send contributions out to organizations, to charities, and so are heavily vested in those things at that point in time. Mordecai, verse 20, wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews near and far. Sounds like, this is the way they communicated. Remember, this is exactly what Haman did when he had his decree signed. This is what Esther did. She and Mordecai, when they had their decree signed, they sent out letters everywhere, far and near, who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, to establish among them that they would celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar. This was to, the word establish, the Hebrew word means to validate or to confirm. And so they were establishing, they were confirming, this is going to be a feast that we're going to keep. As the days on which the Jews had rest from their enemies, as the month which was turned from sorrow to joy for them, and from mourning to a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted the custom which they had begun, as Mordecai had written to them, because Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to annihilate them, had cast Pur, that is Lot, to consume them and destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letter that this wicked plot which Haman had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. There you kind of have a synopsis, if you will, a retracing of the history, a summarizing of what led up to it all. It's very quick telling, if you will, of the story of how the Jews were saved. And this, as it said, this was a feast. Notice a couple of things that probably stood out at you. It's a time of feasting and joy. Well, like we say, you can look at it and say, man, that's terrible because it was a bloodbath, but you could also say, yes, but they were saved. And so it all depends on how you look at it. If you were a Persian, it was a terrible day. If you were a Jew, it's a great day. Why? Because they're coming knocking on your doors, dragging you out, making sure they kill you, every one of them. And so they saw it as a time of deliverance, a time to rejoice. But notice also in verse 24, that it tells us a little bit about where it gets its name. The word pure or pur is the Hebrew word, literally means lot. Lots. And remember, there was by Haman, there was the casting of lots with regards to when they would be destroyed. He'd already made up his mind he was going to destroy the Jews, but there was a casting of lots to determine when. And so it just says, it gives us an insight really into the name Purim, the idea of lots. Well, why would they talk about this being the casting of lots? Well, it goes back to the earlier part in chapter 3 of our story. And so they, excuse me. And so it says in the last verse that we read there, verse 25, that Esther became before the king, and notice that he commanded by letter that the wicked plot of Haman had been devised against the Jews. But that should be upon who? That should be upon. Remember? Look what it says, should return on his own head, and that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. So the king said, okay, I've decreed that this should happen. Which is an interesting thought, because you look one place in the text and it seems as if Esther and Mordecai have come up with all of this and have already killed Haman and his sons. And had already, they remember they had the signet ring, and so they had everything that they needed. They had been given the authority to do as they wanted. Now the king's willing to say, yes, I took responsibility for that. And so the feast then began. And so they called these days, verse 26, Purim, which is the plural for pure or pur. And so they called these days Purim after the name Pur. Therefore, because of all the words of this letter, what they had seen concerning this matter and what had happened to them, the Jews established and imposed it upon themselves and their descendants and all who would join them, that without fail they would celebrate these 2 days every year, according to the written instructions and according to the prescribed time, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation and every family, every province, and every city, that these days of Purim excuse me, should not fail to be observed among the Jews, and that the memory of them should not perish among the descendants. So you get a sense of this was all about, and it's kept every year to remind them. Look what it says in verse 28, that they should be remembered, that they should remember this story, that they should remember what happened. And thus, the Jews on this day, not only, like say, if you look on our calendar, usually you'll see, if you get a Hallmark calendar, you'll see somewhere around in February or March, you'll see Purim, and that's all you'll see. If you don't know this story, you might wonder about it. But if you know the story, then you say, well, I know where it came from. I know what goes on. But on that day, the Jews get together. They have a feast. They have a celebration. They give presents. They send their charity out. They also, one of the things that is interesting when you think about what they do is they gather in the synagogue. And the book of Esther is read. And then they have daily prayers, daily prayer times and daily prayers. And in those daily prayers, there are things that are added. And I'm not really sure exactly what, but there are things added to their daily prayers on the day of Purim, probably Thanksgiving for deliverance. But they add some to their daily prayer on Purim and keep this as a regular feast. So think about something. Many of the Jewish festivals, Jewish holidays, Jewish days of remembrance, there's at least somewhere within the day, some part of the law or of God's word read. Now think about our holidays, and how often do we stop to read part of the scriptures in those holidays? But the Jewish folks, according to their heritage, according to what God has given, they spend a little time within those festival times, within those days of celebration, reading from God's word. And so then, as they read this instruction, they are reminded, and so they remember. They remember what? They remember the story. They remember so they won't forget. They remember so that they'll basically know where they came from. You know, that's the old expression. You want to remember where you came from. And Jewish folks want to remember, they definitely want to remember where they came from. And so they keep Purim and they read the book of Esther. And all of this is done so that they can remember that the days of Purim should not fail to be observed among the Jews and that the memory of them should not perish among the descendants. Anything else? No. Well, yeah, Acts. There seems to be a reference to it. Where is it? Is it Acts 12? But not that per se that I recall really. Seems like I'll have to look that up. There's a reference that seems like some have said that was probably Purim, but not that I recall. Yeah. Right. You don't. You don't. You don't. Yeah, I know it. It is. Uh, but it was, excuse me, it was given so late because think about the law itself. Now, there's a great debate over, when did Moses live? When did he receive the law? At what year? Was it 6,000, BC or when was it? But remember, from a time-wise, this is Esther, the book of Esther is 459 BC. And so it is right before, it is really one of the last, from a standpoint of chronology, it's one of the last books of the Old Testament written. And it happened in this time frame. Started out in 465 to about 458, somewhere, well, actually, but started before that, 469 to about 458, 457, somewhere in there, that time frame is some of the last details of it. So, yeah, even then, it would have been considered, think about it, only something that they had been keeping for 400 plus years. It's not something that they had been keeping since the law, but it is interesting that it's not mentioned in the New Testament. Yeah, probably. Right, right, right. You could do this one at home. Yeah, there was only two you really had to go back to Jerusalem for, but yeah, you could do this one at home. This was well, what's a good one that everybody just stays at home celebrating? None of them now. We all go somewhere, don't we? Well, yeah, but I seem like I'm always on the road Christmas. So, but a lot of folks are able to stay home. Yeah, I never was. That's the problem. I've never really been at home on Christmas. Yeah, that's all right. Anything else? All good. All really good. Y'all are very good Bible students, and I appreciate you all and the knowledge that you have. Somebody came up Wednesday night and was asking me something. I drew them a diagram. I said, "No, you've seen it before," and they said, "Yep." I thought, fantastic. They didn't agree with me, but that's all right too. So, anyway, verse 29 then. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai, the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm the second letter about Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, with words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim at their appointed time, as Mordecai, the Jew, and Queen Esther had prescribed for them, and as they had decreed for themselves and their descendants concerning the matters of their fasting and lamenting. So the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in a book. So there is this great rejoicing that evidently and this is kind of one that's sprung upon us, and this is part of it that in studying currently, I've not found that they fast, nor do they spend a lot of time in Purim in lamenting what went on. But evidently that was a little bit of it, according to this paragraph. The idea, though, that intrigues me in this paragraph here is the last couple of words, written in the book. Well, what book? Well, we don't know. It could be that it was written in the book that, remember, when the king couldn't sleep, when Ahasuerus couldn't sleep, and he asked for the Chronicles, he asked for the book, the Chronicles of Ahasuerus, and they came in and they read them to them. It could be that it's that book. If it's not, I don't know what it is, and no one else that I've read really has an explanation as far as what it is. And it may not have been that book. It may just been a book of laws that we don't have, or it could be one that we do have that we just don't know what it has reference to. Have you noticed if you watch the DIY shows, the how to do things, if you've ever seen them when they're showcasing the houses, if you notice what they do lately to books, turn them backwards so you can't see the spine to see what the books are. I noticed yesterday before I got out to mow the yard, I was looking at one and they were viewing a house before. And this was a furnished house. They were fixing to redo it. And it had a whole bunch of bookshelves and people were standing right there and the books were turned backwards, which I've seen several times on these shows. But it's like, they fixed that for TV. And so, whatever the book was, it was written. And so it became sort of, if you will, it became law. This is it. This is what's going to happen. Anything else? Well, we want to read the last 3 verses of the 10th chapter and make a couple of comments. A king Ahasuerus imposed tribute on the land and on the island of the sea. Of course, what king doesn't want to pass the tax? Now all the acts of his power and his might and the account of the greatness of Mordecai to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the king of the Medes and Persians? So we do know that there was a book that was kept that had what happened, a historical book. And so it says, verse 3, for Mordecai, the Jew, was second to King Ahasuerus, and was great among the Jews, and well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people, and speaking peace to his countrymen. So Mordecai, for sure, cements his place as prime minister. Now, think about this for a second. Think about Haman and think about his life. Here's a man that somehow, don't know how, because really it just he was there. He got promoted. He was right next to the king. He was second command. For whatever reason, he decided that he wanted to kill the Jews. Now, personally, my take on it is that his own jealousy, his own ego, if you will, created the problem. Now, can I prove that? No. So that's an assumption on my part, and you may have a different assumption, and that's fine. That's fine. It's not whatever it was. Let's just answer it that way. He gets this law passed. He eventually has to lead, remember, Mordecai through the city. Mordecai is wearing the kingly robe. Mordecai is being hailed as great. It was Ahasuerus' way of thanking Mordecai for telling about the plot to overtake him. Haman grows more furious. Haman has gallows built, 7.5 stories high, we found out, or 75 feet. So, 7.5 stories high. Exactly what the gallows were, we don't know. We do know that the Hebrew word, remember we've said this, the Hebrew word for gallows literally means it's the idea of throwing. And so a lot of historians believe that it was some sort of impaling, not hanging, but an impaling where you did hang. And so exactly what it was a terrible means of torture. But remember, the Persians were not pleasant people. If you go back and study history, they were mean and they were vile and they were wicked. And so Haman ends up being hung on his own gallows. God delivers the Jews. But Haman is hung, and Mordecai, who Haman so despised, and so really, I think, modeled the whole idea of getting rid of the Jews. If I can get rid of the Jews, I can get rid of Mordecai. So Haman, not only is his plot foiled, but Mordecai is now put as second in command. He's put as the prime minister, if you will. He's put as right under the king. And he grows in favor with the people, the multitude of brethren. There are those that say that there is some indication, especially in this paragraph, that the brethren grew, as they called them. The Jewish folks grew. Why? Because the Persians said, oh, maybe there is something to this. Or maybe it's just due to the fact that we don't want to end up like these folks. And so there were those that proselytized, there were those that converted, if you will, to Judaism because they saw what was going on. Which, how many, what exactly with regards to that, we're not told. And it's really a terrible way to grow. And you have to ask, are they really converted? So are they just there for the party, if you will? They're just there because they're afraid of what's going to happen to them. But needless to say, this then became part of the Jewish way. Now, you got a couple of minutes. Anything anybody like to say or ask before I make kind of an ending to all this? Well, let's think about this. We've talked about this before, but I'm going to kind of lead you into what I want to spend about 6 weeks on. I've finally figured out about the lessons that I want to give on Providence. And so we'll probably spend about 6 weeks on Providence. We may spend a little longer, may spend a little shorter, so don't hold me to that, but that's kind of my plan now. In the book of Esther, we don't find the mention of God. We don't find Lord from the standpoint of God. We don't find Lord from the standpoint of Yahweh, God's name, in the book of Esther. But we see his hand throughout that whole story. We see him working, if you will, his way to save his people. It is a very important part of the Jewish history. It's a very important part of the Jewish legacy. It is a very important part with regards to us. Now, as you look at the providence of God, we're probably going to have, sort of like we've been studying angels on Wednesday night, we're probably going to have more questions than we got answers. Because I believe in the providence of God, but I'm not real sure how it all works out. But then, as we will say so many times in the series in Providence of God, we look back at our life and we say, that worked out just right. And we'll look at that a lot. But as one guy that I was reading this week made the statement, he said, it's quite interesting to read the book of Esther and never find the name of God, but yet see him on almost in every verse. His working, his hand. That's God. That's God for us. What a blessing God is to our lives. But the great thing is that God watches over us, that God protects us, that God makes sure that he's present, but that he works all things together for good. Now, we'll see, as we'll study Providence, we see it in this book, There's some hard times sometimes, and there's some difficulties that build character, that build not only character, but just build our faith. And sometimes we have to remember in the providence of God working out that it's not just my timetable, but it's everybody else that's involved in my story's timetable as well. So why did it take so long for the selection committee to find out that Paul Daugherty was a good fit for River Road? I don't know. And to be honest, those good folks that were on it don't know either. But I'm thankful that it's worked the way it has. I hope you are too. But that's the providence of God. And so when we look at the book of Esther and we say, man, that was a great story, but it took so long. Yeah, but that's all right. Because things had to happen and everybody's schedule, everybody's time frame had to get to the right point. But that's God's hand. And so we learn a lot of things. We learn about choices. We learn a lot about pride and how that it ended up really destroying a man. We learn about how this feast that, if we were to see it like on our calendar, we'd say, well, we can go back to the book of Leviticus. We can't find it. Where did it come from? Here's where it came from, Purim. And we see a lot about God in this great book. Anything else that you'd like to say or comment or add or subtract or multiply or divide? Well, all right. Oh, yes. In studying the story of Purim this week, I did not know this. I found this out. It's interesting that in the celebrations of Purim, some folks write Haman's name on the soles of their shoes so that they can walk on it. Some write his name on stones and throw them. Some folks take a person from the standpoint of a what would you call it, like a paper mache, an effigy. They burn in effigy what looks to be like Haman, or what they would assume Haman would look like. And they burn him, which is an interesting, and also something else that's used a lot with regards to today's Jew is that this is also a time in which in their feast and festivals, their times of merriment, they'll wear masks. And there's really, I didn't understand the reason for the mask, but it's just something they practice in this day and age. So I just found that interesting. I did not know those few little facts about Purim. Anything else? Let's bow for a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful to you for this day, so thankful that you love us and watch over us, so thankful for the care that you give to us. We ask that you watch over us and bless us, keep us. Thank you for the story of Esther and for really how it adds insight in so many ways into us better understanding your providence. And as we begin that study of providence, may we accept it by faith and move forward, knowing that you constantly watch for us, look out for us, and that you take care of us. We ask that you be with us, bless us, and keep us. Hold us as we hold to you, for this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Y'all have a great week. We thank y'all.